intervention in response to backlash against rising numbers of professional women artists and the secessionist valorization of the decorative. Secessionist Vienna's women's art movement deserves to be integrated into a lineage that includes the 1970s feminist art movement and the contemporary craftivist movement of the present. Critical to my book is the secessionist valorization of the decorative and applied arts and handcraft. The Vienna Secessionists were a group of modern artists breaking away from the conservative Artists Guild to found a new league dedicated to creative freedom, originality, and artistic timeliness. Secessionism did not imply any one aesthetic style, but more so an attitude of creative freedom and youthful rebellion. The Vienna Secessionist motto, "To the age its art, to art its freedom," was emblazoned on its building's facade and exemplified this philosophy of creative freedom and timeliness. Critically, both in theory and in exhibitions, the secessionists placed equal weight on the fine arts of painting and sculpture and the applied arts or handcraft. That is, fields where artistic objects often, but not always, served practical functions in contradistinction to painting and sculpture. Particularly the progressive Klimt group, or circle of artists around Gustav Klimt, believed that finely crafted furniture and decorative accessories could not only beautify everyday life, but usher in closer contacts between artists, craftswomen and men, and society, whereby art would permeate every aspect of daily life. This was part and parcel of their ideal of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art, the idea of a perfectly coordinated style unifying art, architecture, and design. Led by Josef Hoffmann and Koloman Moser, secessionist artists founded the well-known Vienna Workshops, or Wiener Werkstätte, in 1903. It was a commercial design venture, attracting the secession's leading artists as collaborators, and in the interwar period was dominated by women. Commencing production with metalwork, the Werkstätte expanded to encompass leatherwork, toy making, textiles, embroidery, fashion, and ceramics, many of which were fields that had, or came to have, particular associations to femininity and women. Adam, the screen is not advancing. The work of the Werkstätte's so-called crafty women, coming from the almost untranslatable German term Kunstgewerbeweib, was informed by contemporary movements like Expressionism, Cubism, abstraction, and abstractionism, and primitivism, much like the primitivizing currents of folk art and children's art, informing the design of this chess set that was shown at the well-known Vienna Kunstschau exhibition of 1908. But before going into the details of the book, why was the Werkstätte's emphasis on applied art so critical to women and the sort of women profiled in my book? To quote feminist art historian Rozika Parker from her book, The Subversive Stitch, feminine craft-based genres like needlework were seen as, quote, mindless, decorative, and delicate, like the icing on the cake, good to look at, adding taste and status, but devoid of significant content, end quote. From the time of the Renaissance, clear hierarchical divisions emerged between fine and applied art, whereby applied art encompassed craft, decorative art, and design. Prior to this, there was no clear-cut value-laden distinction between the work of a craftsperson making, say, a tapestry or silver beaker than an artist making a painting. But it was precisely around the time of the Renaissance that a very clear gender hierarchy of the arts emerged, when the applied arts came to be seen as feminine, decorative, and inferior, associated with lesser degrees of intellectual effort and manual skill. What is interesting about the artists in the female secession is not that they specialized in the decorative and applied arts, but that they did so in a manner that provocatively subverted the established conventions surrounding feminine handcraft. They experimented with similar ideas and movements as male artists working in the fine arts, painting and sculpture. For instance, the prolific textile designs of Maria Licha-Strauss, who was co-director of the Wiener Werkstätte's fashion department. Her textile designs experimented with similar trends to abstraction as contemporary painting. This is much like the geometrical designs informing this innovative genre of beaded glass purses. Again, experimentation with contemporary movements. All of this boundary-defying decorative art is an important corrective to conventional understandings that movements like abstractionism made few inroads into interwar Vienna, which was traditionally viewed as an artistic backwater. Indeed, this shows that decorative art and design could think through contemporary movements in a similar manner as painting or sculpture. So my book examines the forgotten story of secessionist Vienna's women's art movement and the radical feminist potential of women-only artistic culture. It looks at the Vienna Women's Academy, founded in 1897, the Association of Austrian Women Artists, founded in 1910, and particularly its radical feminist offshoot, a group called the Wiener Frauenkunst, which means Viennese women's art, which was founded in 1926. It tells the story of how the female secessionists reclaimed and reinvented the stereotypes surrounding women's art and the decorative. It tells the story of how, in attempting to dislodge fixed oppositions between art and craft, decorative and profound, and ultimately what was assigned as masculine and feminine in art, the female secessionists foreshadowed themes in the better-known explosion of feminist art in the 1970s. Particularly important to the book is the radical women's art collective called the Wiener Frauenkunst, meaning Viennese women's art, founded in 1926. It drew its membership base largely from Women's Academy graduates and included a very large share of Wiener Werkstätte collaborators as well. It was led by Fanny Harflinger, shown here. She was often likened to a sort of female Josef Hoffmann in that she did everything from furniture design to painting to printmaking. But led by Fanny Harflinger, the Wiener Frauenkunst championed the Klimt Group's philosophies on the equality of art and craft and the provocative idea of a separate feminine aesthetic and women's supposedly natural connection to the decorative. But they did so in ways that subverted the gender-specific ideology slotting women into the decorative arts in the first place. Linking interwar Austria's most radical women painters, architects, and a younger generation of artist craftswomen represented in the Vienna workshops, Harflinger and her new league strove to define women's art on their own terms, unconstrained by the gender dialectic surrounding ideas of women's art. The Wiener Frauenkunst had a significant Jewish membership base, somewhere around a third, and strongly represented the artist craftswomen of the Wiener Werkstätte. On the subject of these very strong institutional linkages between the Wiener Frauenkunst and the Wiener Werkstätte, I am very proud to have been involved in writing some of the catalog essays for the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna's very important and landmark exhibition, The Women of the Wiener Werkstätte. Here's the catalog, it's stunning. It provides a comprehensive overview of the 180 women artists active with the Wiener Werkstätte over the course of its history, and moreover, not only the well-known ones, but the total unknowns. In the exhibition and the catalog, we see the remarkable cross-pollination that flowed between high and low forms of expression, whereby, for instance, textiles from the Wiener Werkstätte that were themselves informed by folk art and expressionistic currents. This cross-pollination, whereby textiles informed the surfaced art fields of Klimt portraiture. This experimentation characterizing interwar Austria's decorative art scene, whereby these craftswomen integrated influences from expressionism, cubism, abstractionism, and primitivism, can be directly attributed to women's delayed admission to the Austrian Academy of Fine Arts. Women were not admitted to the Academy of Fine Arts until 1920, and we sort of see this funneling of women's fine artistic ambitions into the applied arts and design. Adam is not going. The ceramic work of Wiener Frauenkunst member Hertha Büscher, who delivered her ceramics to the Wiener Werkstätte on commission, reflected Cubist and Expressionist design principles. Her characteristic broken through style of pottery favored jagged edges, sharp corners, and large areas of hollowed out space, not unlike the rough lines of Expressionist woodcut prints. Entirely untrained as a potter, the ceramic work of Wiener Werkstätte and Wiener Frauenkunst member Hilde Jeser-Schmidt exhibited complex formal structures and painted decoration executed in the same Rococo primitive style as other media. In its deliberately flattened qualities, the vegetal ornament of her serially produced vase from 1921 reflected Cubist design principles, married with the aesthetics of children's drawings. Advance the slide. The Wiener Frauenkunst used perceptions of women artists' suitability for the applied arts to pry open the masculine field of architecture. In a series of woman-centered architecture and design exhibitions curated by the woman architect Leane Zimbler, Wiener Frauenkunst members exhibited model interiors integrating painting, sculpture, and decorative objects into total aesthetic environments, very much in the stamp of the Klimt group. These interiors contested the ways that modernist architectural theorists associated with the streamlined international style were pushing the decorative, the handmade, and hominess to the margins of modernist value systems. These were ideas that originated in part with architect and cultural critic Adolf Loos. These exhibitions also contested how architectural discourse tended to tether Die Neue Frau, the new woman, to the Neues Bauen movement, to the modern international style. Instead, these exhibitions represented an effort to link modern gender roles, as embodied in the new woman, to a more decorative version of architectural modernism than, for instance, German industrial design. Cultural critic and architect Adolf Loos was a longtime opponent of Wiener Werkstätte applied art. He believed it feminized and tarnished solid masculine handcraft. He famously argued that ornament should disappear from objects of daily use and follow a sort of evolutionary trajectory. These ideas would later be taken up by theorists of the so-called international style. That is to say, those who favored a style of architecture and design that was largely undecorated and expressed an object's function. In his well-known essay and lecture, Ornament and Crime, Loos criminalized, infantilized, and feminized the ornamentation of design objects. To quote, "Wherever I abuse the everyday use object by ornamenting it, I shorten its lifespan. Only the whim and ambition of women can be responsible for the murder of this material." Wiener Frauenkunst members contested these ideas both in theory and practice, not only through exhibitions, but popular essays, articles, and even radio broadcasts. They led a woman-centered crusade to reinsert decoration, domesticity, and hominess back into modern architecture. And they did so against the grain of what they saw as overly sober, the German term sachlich, overly sober interiors that were so functional that they were as sterile as a hospital or gymnasium. Exhibitions like How Does the Woman See? We see here the cover to the catalog. Exhibitions like How Does the Woman See? Continued the Klimt's group emphasis on spatial art and modern model interiors, but with a special feminist crusade to rehabilitate feminine decoration. Wiener Frauenkunst president Fanny Harflinger argued that the modernist living machines placed a virtual ban on pictures, decorative art, and handcraft, and these living machines hardly provided for their inhabitants' psychological needs. The spirited organizer encouraged exhibition's female visitors to demand something higher from the home than rational engineering, a comfortable but artistic domesticity that provided for residents' well-being and spiritual renewal. The Wiener Frauenkunst crusade against the anti-domestic living machine climaxed in the 1933 exhibition, The Beautiful Wall, an exhibition in which easel painting was shown as a footnote to decorative art itself. As she charged, quote, "We created the ideal of the blank, unornamented wall, but this alone does not satisfy the need for fantasy on the part of its inhabitants, who do not want to constantly be in the purpose-driven space of a sanatorium. It is not to everyone's taste to serve the false god of Sachlichkeit or sobriety forever." Such convictions were shared by Wiener Frauenkunst members like, for instance, Emmy Zweibruck, who was well known internationally as a craftswoman, pedagogue, and children's book illustrator. Publishing widely on contemporary handcraft, she ran applied arts workshops that specialized in textiles, embroidery, and toys, and ran this in tandem with her progressive craft school for girls, very much based on secessionist educational principles. Both her school and workshops cultivated a naive design language inspired by folk art and children's drawings. We can see this characteristic style on the lace work she showed at the 1925 Decorative Art Exposition in Paris. In her writings, Zweibruck called for a reaction against the new architectural sobriety to reinscribe ornament into modernist design. A passage from an article from 1932 likened the unornamented, whitewashed interiors of the international style to an aesthetic straitjacket that was in fact more constraining than the decorative systems against which modernist architects defined their work. To quote Zweibruck, "We have abandoned the ornament because it has been misunderstood, degraded, and profaned. Nowadays, we build sober-looking, practical houses. We live in rooms with blank walls. Our furniture is plain and bare of ornaments." Zweibruck called on women to take inspiration from, quote, "memories of our mothers and grandmothers, simple and fine handcraft," end quote, and the solid craft knowledge of peasants and primitive peoples. Quote, "We must also try to ornament and embellish the objects of daily use with our own hands to bring beauty, decoration, and domesticity back into the home." Now, she sounded this call not only to professional women artists, but to amateurs as well, which was a very bold mood given the ways that dilettantism had traditionally clouded the ambitions of professional women artists. In a very real way, this revival of matriarchal modes of transmission and latent feminine consciousness formed a woman-centered lineage that anticipated those of the 1970s feminist art collective. Zweibruck was equally known as a child art pedagogue and had theories paralleling those of Klimt Group member Franz Cizek. Cizek is well known as the discoverer of untutored children's drawings. He was one of the first teachers to allow children to draw from their imaginations and express inner feelings rather than accurately depict reality. Members of the Klimt Group and Vienna Secession found children's art so important that they hung it next to their own at the important 1908 Kunstschau exhibition. My latest project actually focuses on Zweibrück's role in popularizing and commodifying secessionist ideas of child creativity in post-war America. She immigrated here after 1939, and her role as artistic director of the American Crayon Company and editing its promotional journal, Everyday Art. So for the rest of the presentation, I want to give you just a little bit more so you have a little bit of better idea in the book. So the book basically offers case studies of different media in which women artists experimented: textiles, interior design, toy making, and ceramics. And I'm going to focus on ceramics for the rest of the talk, just to give you something a little more specific, and then we'll wrap up to leave room for questions. Mining similar primitivizing influences as the better-known heroes of Viennese Expressionism, like Oskar Kokoschka and Ion Schiele, members of Harflinger's Radical League would also participate in the Viennese Expressionist breakthrough, but not through the medium of the easel canvas, but through craft-based media like toys, ceramics, and textiles, as well as architecture and interior design. Many of these artists took inspiration from the formal qualities of untutored children's drawings and folk art, as well, as we see reflected in the design of this chess set. This intellectual discovery of these quote unquote primitive sources points to the understudied phenomenon of primitivism in Viennese modernism, much more influential than previously thought, I would suggest. In an era in which critics posited a mental closeness between women and children, working in a deliberately childlike, primitive style represented a bold feminist statement, valorizing the discursive nexus between women, children, and folk cultures. Recruited for the Wiener Werkstätte because of their perceived naivete and isolation from academic institutions, female art students pioneered a new genre of expressionist ceramics informed by the primitivizing currents of folk art and untutored children's drawings, as well as other contemporary movements. These feminine vessels exemplified bold experimentations in the expressive possibilities of handcraft, conveying an expressive will to form beyond object's function. In the book, I use the term feminine vessels to stress how critics viewed the field in terms of a feminine aesthetic defined by its female practitioners. This feminine aesthetic juxtaposed, in some cases, the overly civilized femininity and figural subject matter of the Rococo with the rough-hewn formal distortions of the primitive. Wiener Frauenakademie graduate Susie Singer took inspiration from the figural subject matter of 18th century porcelain sculpture, but inflected it with a sense of childlike naivete and nostalgia. Notably, Singer was entirely untrained as a potter before working for the Wiener Werkstätte. Of particular attention to critics were the functional vessels and sculptures, both small scale and large scale, created by Vali Wieseltier. You see her here standing, created by Vali Wieseltier, head of the Wiener Werkstätte ceramics department, and her female proteges like Kitty Rix sitting here, and Gudrun Baldich. Look out for this sculpture. We'll see it again in finished form. Sculptures, their ceramic sculpture was notable for its formal asymmetry and imperfection, unevenly applied bright glazes and decoration, and spontaneous processes of design, particularly visible in Wieseltier's trademark Frauenkopf, or woman's head, just means woman's head. The Wieseltier Frauenkopf featured conspicuous distortions and faces painted to appear deliberately made up. This form was influenced by a long tradition of ceramic satire and humor. Critically, these heads, this ceramic sculpture confronted pejorative criticism, limiting women's art making to her propensity to decorate and make up herself. Much like her sitting figure with flower pots, we saw it being made in the 2 slides ago. So much like her 1928 sculpture, sitting figure with flower pots, Visotir and her proteges translated the stylistic principles of these small-scale heads into monumental proportions in a manner that challenged pottery's connotations to femininity, domesticity, and amateurism. And there we see the sculpture again. Pioneering the post-war expressionist ceramic movement was a younger generation of female art students trained at the secessionist-dominated School of Applied Arts and Viennese Women's Academy. A critical venue for expressionist ceramics was the Wiener Werkstätte's artist workshops, which opened in 1916 and was equipped with a kiln and wheels. The artist workshops was predominated by an atmosphere of informal collegiality, creative exchange, and female collectivity, which was very pronounced given a wartime shortage of men. It was almost all women there. The artist workshop offered talented newcomers the chance to experiment with unconventional materials and techniques, free of concerns of utility. These artists either design unique one-offs for which they received commission, or also prototypes for serial production. The acknowledged leader of the expressionist ceramics movement, Visotir, likened the artist workshops to a woman-only space, a sort of Arcadian paradise, and remembered, and I quote, "It's huge studio. Each one of us got a key for himself, and we had all the workshops imaginable for our own free use. We also had the best trained foremen and workers and all of the time and materials we desired." But these interwar artist craftswomen were not without their critics. In no uncertain terms did the Wiener Werkstätte artist craftswoman figure to the general public as a desexed hermaphrodite who tainted handcraft with experimental techniques and primitivizing influences that seemed to reduce art making to childish scribbles, what you see reflected in this cartoon. Part of the controversy surrounding expressionist ceramics related not only to their formal material qualities, but the sexual emancipation of their makers. One artist workshop member recalled, quote, "I believe that the love affairs and frustrated love affairs influenced the work of the female artist. They had the ideal of being unconventional, expressing oneself through love affairs, having as many sexual experiences as possible," end quote. And these are pictures of the leading Wiener Werkstätte female artists. Indeed, these interwar artist craftswomen were known for their personal habits of drinking, smoking, their fashionably androgynous modes of self-presentation, their bobbed hairstyles, and sometimes mannish clothing, sometimes not. So pronounced was this rejection of middle-class propriety that the real Wiener Werkstätte artist craftswoman inspired a fictional trope in interwar literature. We see this most clearly in the Joseph Roth novel, The Emperor's Tomb. When the protagonist of this novel, Lieutenant von Trade, returns from the Eastern Front during the Great War, he is shocked to find his formerly feminine and proper wife, Elisabeth, totally transformed. She has traded housekeeping for designing outrageous furniture, decorative trinkets, inspired by contemporary movements, painted in the most garish colors possible. Compounding this meltdown of middle-class values was her affair with another craftswoman, Yolande Satmar, who was an outspoken craftswoman attracted to African art and progressive social causes. The real-life embodiment of the fiery Yolande, Valérie Visotir was the movement's acknowledged leader. She was a spirited nonconformist who rejected conventional expectations like marriage, child rearing, and preferred chain smoking and male attire. As a child, she was a champion athlete in swimming, diving, skiing, tennis, and hockey, and hailed from a privileged milieu of well-off, Viennese Jewish family. A drawing teacher encouraged Valley to pursue her dream of attending art school in defiance of her conservative parents. After a prolonged battle, she finally studied at the Women's Academy from 1912 to 1914 with secessionist Otto Friedrich, and pursued further studies with Hoffmann, Moser, and Chisek at the Kunstgewerbeschule at the School of Applied Arts from 1914 to 1918, while volunteering as a war nurse. When Hoffmann recruited her for the artist workshops in 1917, Valley possessed no formal knowledge of or training in ceramics, much like her other colleagues, Susie Singer or Hilde Jesse-Schmidt. She recalled that one afternoon, quote, "I got by chance a lump of clay and modeled a figure so expressive that Hoffmann declared, 'Now at last I know that Valley is a sculptor.'" Hoffmann, in fact, curated a carefully studied childlike naivete among artist workshop members, what was in fact marketed in Wiener Werkstätte sales catalog, and is also confirmed by the confession of Susie Singer, one of Wieseltier's colleagues, that the director sought out, quote, "playfulness and humor" for the Wiener Werkstätte, and Singer's admission that she, quote, "had never studied ceramics formally or even had the soft clay under her fingers. Rather, she was recruited as, in her words, an experiment of sort." So there was this deliberate attraction among secessionist educators to the untrained, or the supposedly untrained. Operating the acclaimed ceramics workshops Valley Wieseltier from 1922 to 1927, Wieseltier defined the movement's intuitive approach to the material that eschewed technical perfection and emphasized expressivity of gesture and process. In a series of articles, Wieseltier laid out her working process and detailed how she used vessel-based methods of construction for expressive ends. The real technique for pottery is always the pot. No matter whether it is a figure, an animal, a candlestick, or anything else, it must always grow out of the material. It must be made in the same manner as the pot, hollow inside, worked from within to the outside. Privileging emotional spontaneity, the artist admitted, quote, "Only when I feel what can be built at the wheel do I design a form," end quote. When glazing, she held that, quote, "I place absolutely no weight on achieving a smooth, uniform surface, but mix the glaze in all possible nuances and let the fire reign." So it was quite remarkable. She used this, this vessel-based method of construction, not only to make pots, but constructed these over life-size, these large ceramic sculptures using this vessel-based technique, which was sort of a subversive move. In small-scale sculpture, Wieseltier's trademark was her earthenware women's heads. Wiener Werkstätte artists like Wieseltier, Singer, Kalm, others debuted this form at the 1920 Kunstschau. Also apparent in large-scale ceramic sculpture, their heads were modeled in the guise of mythological goddesses, nymphs, bacchantes, with deliberately rough modeling and expressive distortions. But by the mid-1920s, these women's heads were stripped of these mythological illusions and rather portrayed the new woman celebrated in interwar society. Like this 1928 version, the heads shared traits like elongated necks and long, languid faces with almond-shaped eyes, carefully stylized eyebrows. They featured bold, visible cosmetics, painted in a deliberately haphazard, almost childlike fashion. And in sardonic emulation of the perfect porcelain complexion, the white clay slip was applied in a manner that sometimes left visible the raw earthenware beneath, suggesting an imperfect application of cosmetics. Lending the form productive tension was her chosen medium of earthenware. Earthenware was typically associated with everyday domestic usage, tableware, and was notably less refined than stoneware or porcelain. the more obvious choice for ceramic sculpture. Both hiding and revealing its origins at the wheel, Wieseltier's vessel-based technique played on conventions of equating components of thrown pots with parts of the female body. Usually this convention proceeded from top to bottom of the pot, from top to bottom, from neck to foot. But this Frauenkopf's neck is in the wrong place, as if standing on its head, suggesting the transgression of a pot that was not domestic, a pot masquerading as a glamorous woman. Joining the Wiener Werkstätte in 1926 as Wieseltier's pupil, Gudrun Balditsch created some of the most provocative interpretations of this woman's head form. These 1927 heads carried Wieseltier's expressive tendencies to an extreme in their exaggerated elongation and turbulent formal choppiness. The head's abrupt vertical slicing lent the sculptures a mask-like aura, and the faces possessed a sort of unnervingly cold or sort of sachlich, objective facial expression that complicated notions of natural feminine beauty. Like her mentor, Balditsch exposed the sexualized mask of face painting in her garish color palette of oranges and blues and tattoo-like geometrical decorations. As I suggest in the book, the reasons for the conspicuously made-up nature of the Wiener Werkstätte Frauenkopf were not accidental, but a deliberate riposte to misogynist critics who charged that interwar Austrian handcraft had become regrettably feminized through its predominantly female practitioners. In particular, the predominance of women at the Austrian pavilion at the 1925 Decorative Art Exposition in Paris. This triggered a barrage of public attacks, most notably in Adolf Loos's infamous Wiener Weh lecture, meaning Viennese woe. It's a play on the name of the Wiener Werkstätte. And in this lecture, he attributed the decline of Austrian handcraft to the Wiener Werkstätte's, quote, painting, embroidering, ceramic making, valuable material wasting, dilettante daughters of senior civil servants. He was very much meaning the women covered in my book and covered here, like Wieseltier. Meanwhile, Wieseltier began transposing the Frauenkopf's stylistic principles into monumental proportions and continued this dialogue with pupils like Balditsch. The years around 1927, 1928 witnessed an upsurge in her large-scale ceramic output, enabled by her 1928 decision to incorporate her workshops into the Wiener Werkstätte and accept a position as head of the Wiener Werkstätte ceramics department. This brought the artist a steady income and access to materials, facilitating her large-scale work, and also her emigration to New York. She moved to New York first provisionally in 1928 and then permanently in 1932. And here we see a publicity photo from her first solo exhibition. There she presented herself as a ceramic sculptor, free of the pejorative discourse clinging to the Wiener Werkstätte, or at least attempted to, but that's really another story. In conclusion, I will leave you with a few thoughts. Decorative handcrafts are commonly associated with an image of unthreatening docility, much like these fashion students pinning up a hem. But the artists connected with interwar Vienna's female secession created artworks that disrupted established boundaries between high and low, between function and utility, and masculine and feminine fields of expression. The female secession recaptures the radical potential of what Harfinger referred to as, quote, works from women's hands, in putting forth an alternative version of Viennese modernism that never turned on its ornamental decorative roots. In honor of Women's History Month, let us remember these forgotten feminist foremothers and their pioneering roles in reclaiming female artistic culture, and for showing the radical and experimental potential of works from women's hands. So thank you very much. And I am so grateful for your patience with the technical issues here.
Thanks so much, Megan. That was great. And I think so fitting for Women's History Month. We have about 10 minutes left for questions. There are two ways in which you can ask Megan questions. You can either go ahead and unmute yourself and ask, or you can go ahead and put questions in the chat box and I can read them for you. I do see that we have someone has raised their hand. Would you like to ask the first question?
Okay. Looks like we've got video back.
Thank you. Hi, Professor Fowler. Thank you so much for the excellent talk. It was very enriching and informative, and I enjoyed it very much. In the interest of time, I'll just limit myself to one question, which is, you showed us that within the female secessionist movement, there were curiosity about representation of men from the global south, like the Chinaman with the horse ceramic.
Yeah.
And certainly you mentioned there was interest in African art. I'm just wondering if there was any curiosity or representation of femininity from the global south. I would be very curious about that, because I thought that the Chinaman ceramic, perhaps, and I could be wrong, may have been like almost an orientalization of masculinity from the global south, which, as we know, occurred. Men also played a role in that. So certainly, I'd be just curious to hear if there was what representation of women and femininity from the global south, if any, occurs within the female secessionist movement. Thank you.
Honestly, that was not something that I came across, but it would be something that I would like to investigate. But you were absolutely right about the orientalization of the Chinaman figure and so on and so forth. So that is an awesome question that I don't necessarily have the answer to right now. But thank you. Aruj is a PhD student and a former student of mine who I'm so delighted is here. Thanks for coming. Any questions or comments? We had about every technical difficulty imaginable, despite a complex setup.
I had a question.
Yeah.
About the last image you showed, which was this oversized porcelain figure from, was it Wiesenthal?
Yeah.
And I wonder if in some way, when you look at Vienna and you're going around Vienna, these classical styled huge sculptures of mythical women in the nude or whatever, is this in any way, was there any way you would see that as a corrective or a somehow addressing the classical style and not just the functionalist style?
It absolutely could be. I mean, Wiesenthal was actually very eloquent and wrote extensively, with her ideas on the working process and whatnot. She did not specifically address classical sources like that, but I have no doubt that these very fragile, unique, over life-size ceramic sculptures were somehow directly or indirectly informed by that tradition. I mean, she made a large body of work that was derived from mythology, Salome and whatnot. So I think that's a great supposition. And I mean, I didn't really have a chance to talk about how they were made, but it's incredible that they were actually made as pots. They were the one that I showed at the end were a series of actual pots cobbled together with slip. So it was a very sort of sharp commentary on perhaps this classical tradition, juxtaposing it with domestic pottery usage, added to this virtuoso technique. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Very interesting.
There's a question in the chat that I'll go ahead and read. If I could. In relation to the genealogy of women's art, you build your argument. I wondered if the women of the Wiener Kunst themselves drew on a specific kind of female lineage, from Julia.
Okay. And Julia is also welcome to clarify her question or jump in with a further response. I mean, I guess I could answer it this way. Because I think this is maybe what she means with the specific kind of female lineage. Were the artists of the Wiener Frauenkunst, to what extent did they identify their work with a feminist consciousness? Were they aware that this was provocative, or is this something that I've read into it? And what is interesting is that there definitely was an awareness of that they were doing something provocative and feminist. I talk in the book about the parallels with the feminist art movement of the 1970s. And although the art of this interwar Vienna movement was not as overtly political, it was very artistically feminist. And they talk about countering, anti-decorative criticism and going against male architectural critics and so on and so forth. If Julie, if you're there, if you want to tell me what you mean by a specific kind of a female lineage, but I can say that many of the artists of the female secession were very interested in needlework and embroidery. One of the things that they did was, I didn't really get to go into this presentation, but one reason why this group was so radical is that they weren't just concerned with reaching professional women artists, but they were concerned with forming bonds with amateurs. And that was quite bold indeed, because the way that women artists, have been disparaged as amateurs in the past. So for these very highly accomplished professionals to sort of hold hands with amateurs and say, you are also capable of artistically significant work. So they were encouraging amateur needleworkers to try to produce, artistically interesting work, not just stitch pre-printed embroidery patterns, but like rediscover the work of folk artists, folk art as a sort of basis. So I'm not sure, I hope that answers Julia's question, but I would say that the lineage was very strong in needlework, embroidery, textile art.
Julia,
if I may respond.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This was great. And also the answer. I just wondered kind of maybe even more specifically if they had specific kind of women, craftswomen, or any kind that they would mention often, or was it more in the way that you illustrated that it's a kind of broader inspiration of folk art?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for the clarification. So they didn't really name artists in particular, but basically encouraged women artists, whether amateur needleworkers or professionals, to reinvigorate their practice by looking at folk art sources. So it wasn't naming specifics, but encouraged them to go back to the days in which folk art was real and folk art was alive. And obviously, very well what that means. But when sort of amateur art flourished in a good way, but sort of before industrialization, commercialization of this sort of thing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I see some questions in the, I'll let Kristen.
Well, just to say that I think we only have time for one more question, because we do need to be very mindful that we have to leave the Zoom account at 3, partly because we have a different program that starts then. But so I'll do Tom's question. Rachel, I see your question, and perhaps Megan can reach out to you after the talk, but we'll just do this one last question, which is just how much of the Vienna workshop art, because I'm not going to try and pronounce it, the Vienna workshop art survived the Second War?
Okay, well, that is not, that's a question that's sort of hard to answer, because the focus of the Vienna workshops was not painting, but everyday art for the household. So to my knowledge, there's never been a complete, taking census of where everything is. But, Works are divided between public museums and private collections. Many objects were produced serially, like the ceramics. So there are so many things around. Obviously, a lot of it was scattered internationally. Many of the artists, the Wiener Werkstätte had a strong Jewish support base and patronage base. So these objects were forced with families into exile, or of course were stripped away from them, even much worse fates in the Holocaust. So that's sort of a broader question.
All right, and we do have to end there, but there's two really great questions there in the chat box. I'm also going to put the discount code back into the chat. You can use that for 30% off this book, and I certainly hope you do. If you don't want to buy the book yourself, just a reminder that we do actually have it in the collection at the Millbrook Library if you are a local, and we would love for you to come in and check it out. This is obviously it, so I have it now, but it'll be back in the collection on Monday, and I hope to start seeing it circulate. It's also available through Hoopla, through the Millbrook Library. If you have any questions about how to use Hoopla as a resource, the librarians and the clerks there would be happy to help you out. Thanks so much. This is the point where if we were in a room together, we would clap. We are not in a room together, but I'm sure we all feel like clapping. Thanks, Megan, for this wonderful presentation. And thanks everyone for attending.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. That's right there. That was a here. How